Who could strike fear into the heart of Bumpy Johnson, a man who walked into rooms full of armed killers and never once reached for his own gun? A man the Italian mob called the Emperor of Harlem. A man who did 18 years in federal prison and came out more dangerous than when he went in. There was exactly one person on this earth who could make Bumpy Johnson lower his eyes. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly who that was and why. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not fear bullets. He did not fear prison. He did not fear the Italian families who controlled every other corner of organized crime in New York City. For over 3 decades, Bumpy Johnson stood as the single most feared and respected black gangster in America, a man who negotiated with mob bosses as an equal and buried the men who tried to test him. But even emperors answer to someone. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the one relationship that defined the limits of Bumpy Johnson's power. A relationship built on respect so deep it bordered on reverence, and it is not the story you think it is. Here's the question that's puzzled Harlem historians for decades. Bumpy Johnson feared no man. He walked past armed Italian enforcers without blinking. He faced down police captains, judges, and rival numbers runners with the same flat, unbothered stare. Historians and the people who lived alongside him describe a man who had made peace with death so completely that violence simply stopped working on him as a threat. So who, in a world built entirely on fear, commanded something different from Bumpy Johnson? Who was the one figure this untouchable man deferred to, protected, and by some accounts, quietly answered to for the better part of his criminal life? The answer takes us into the highest levels of American organized crime, into a system so much larger than Harlem that even its most feared son had to bend the knee. And the story of how that respect was earned is soaked in blood, prison time, and one of the most consequential deals in the history of the American underworld. To understand why this relationship mattered, you first have to understand exactly what Bumpy Johnson was in Harlem, because Gangster barely covers it. By the 1930s, Bumpy had already built a reputation as the enforcer for Stephanie St. Clair, the fierce black policy queen who ran Harlem's numbers racket and refused to hand her territory over to the Italian mob without a fight. When Dutch Schultz moved to seize the Harlem numbers business by force, it was Bumpy who stood in the gap, running muscle, running strategy, and refusing to break even as bodies started dropping around him. He survived that war. Dutch Schultz did not. And when the dust settled, Bumpy Johnson had transformed from a soldier into a name that carried weight on both sides of 110th Street. What made Bumpy different from every other Harlem hustler wasn't just his willingness to fight, it was his composure. Contemporaries described a man who read poetry, who quoted Shakespeare in casual conversation, who dressed like a diplomat and carried himself like one too, right up until the moment violence became necessary, and then he became someone else entirely. He did federal time at Alcatraz, one of the most brutal prisons in American history, and by every account came out of it colder, sharper, and more respected than when he went in. Prison didn't break him, it calcified him. By the time Bumpy returned to Harlem in the 1950s, the old rules of the streets had shifted, but Bumpy's standing hadn't. He ran his own operation, he answered himself. Younger hustlers who came up under him, including a young street operator named Frank Lucas, later described Bumpy less like a boss and more like royalty, a man other criminals stood a little straighter around. And that's exactly what makes this next part so strange to people who only know the surface-level legend. Because for all of Bumpy's independence, for all his fearlessness, there was one power structure above Harlem that even he could not simply outmuscle. That structure was the Italian-American Mafia's national ruling body, what came to be known as the Commission, and the man whose shadow stretched over that entire system, even from exile, was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Now, here's where the story gets interesting, because this was never a relationship built on fear in the way you'd expect. It wasn't Luciano's guns that mattered. Luciano wasn't standing over Harlem with an army pointed at Bumpy's operation. What Luciano represented was something bigger and, in its own way, far more dangerous. Order, structure, a system of rules that determined who was allowed to operate, where, and under what terms, backed by every organized crime family on the East Coast, acting in concert rather than as scattered rivals. After the chaotic bloodshed of the Dutch Schultz War, it became painfully clear to everyone in New York's underworld black and Italian alike, that unregulated territorial violence was bad for business. Bodies in the street brought police, brought headlines, brought federal attention nobody wanted. Luciano, largely credited with modernizing organized crime into something closer to a corporate structure, helped establish the framework that ended the free-for-all. Under this new order, Harlem's numbers racket was allowed to continue operating, but only within boundaries the Commission approved of, and only with a cut flowing back toward the larger syndicate. Bumpy Johnson understood something most street-level operators never grasped. Raw fearlessness gets you a seat at the table, but it doesn't get you to keep that seat. Longevity in that world required knowing exactly who held real institutional power versus who simply held a gun. Bumpy could outfight almost anyone in Harlem. He could not out-organize the Commission, and he knew it. So what developed instead of open conflict was something far rarer in that world, a working respect. Bumpy operated with a level of protection and legitimacy in Harlem that came, in part, from having proven himself reliable within the boundaries the Commission set. He paid what needed to be paid, he kept violence controlled and predictable rather than chaotic, and in return, Harlem's numbers operation and Bumpy's standing within it remained largely undisturbed by the kind of Italian incursions that had triggered the Schultz War in the first place. This wasn't a submission. People who knew Bumpy were clear about that. It was something closer to professional deference, the same instinct that makes a brilliant general respect the general who trained him, even after surpassing him on the battlefield. Bumpy never groveled. He never postured as anyone's subordinate. But multiple accounts from people close to him describe a man who spoke about Luciano and the Commission's authority, with a rare note of caution in his voice, a tone he simply did not use for anyone else in his world. Not police captains, not judges, not rival Harlem gangsters. There's a reason for that caution, and it goes back to what the Commission actually represented. Luciano hadn't just built a gang, he had built an institution capable of outlasting any single man's reputation, an institution with reach into police departments, courtrooms, labor unions, and other crime families up and down the East Coast. Bumpy's power in Harlem was personal. It lived and died with him. Luciano's power was structural. It would have outlived him even in exile, which it did. That distinction is the key to understanding the entire relationship. Bumpy Johnson could be feared by any single man on any single block in Harlem, but an institution doesn't fear. An institution simply decides whether you're useful to keep around. And Bumpy's genius, the thing that let him survive Alcatraz, survive the Schultz War, survive decades in one of the most violent professions in American history, was knowing exactly how to remain useful, valuable, and respected within a system he could never fully control. So here's the moment that crystallizes everything. By multiple historical accounts, the arrangement that let Harlem's numbers business survive the aftermath of the Schultz War was not simply handed down, it was negotiated. And Bumpy Johnson, representing Harlem's black policy operators, sat at that table not as a supplicant, but as a man whose reputation for controlled, disciplined violence had earned him the right to speak. This is the detail that separates Bumpy from almost every other black gangster of his era. He wasn't just tolerated by the Commission structure. He was, in his own limited but real way, recognized by it. That recognition is precisely why so many people who knew Bumpy described his attitude toward Luciano's authority as something closer to professional respect than fear. Fear makes you avoid a man. Respect makes you study him, adopt his methods, and speak carefully about him even after he's gone. Bumpy did all three. He modeled parts of his own operation, the discipline, the controlled violence, the emphasis on order over chaos, on the very system that had once threatened to crush him during the Schultz War. The pivotal event, then, wasn't a single confrontation or a single threat. It was the entire aftermath of the 1930s Harlem mob war itself. The moment Bumpy Johnson watched an unregulated conflict nearly destroy everything he'd built, and watched Luciano's commission step in and impose an order that, however uncomfortable, kept Harlem's numbers business alive for decades afterward. In that moment, Bumpy learned the one lesson that no gun and no reputation could teach him. There is a difference between being the most feared man in a neighborhood and being recognized by the system that decides whether that neighborhood gets to keep existing on its own terms at all. That's the man Bumpy Johnson feared. if fear is even the right word. Not a rival, not an enforcer, an institution wearing the face of Charles Lucky Luciano, an institution powerful enough that even Harlem's untouchable emperor understood exactly where his own power ended. So when people ask who Bumpy Johnson feared, the honest answer isn't a name whispered in the streets of Harlem. It's the shadow of the commission itself, embodied by Luciano's legacy, a structure so much larger than any single man that even Bumpy's legendary fearlessness had to operate within its boundaries. What makes this relationship so remarkable isn't that Bumpy bowed to power. It's that he understood the difference between power you can shoot and power you have to negotiate with, and he built his entire 30-year reign in Harlem on knowing exactly which kind he was dealing with at any given moment. That's not a weakness. In a world that chewed up fearless men every single day, that kind of clarity is exactly what kept Bumpy Johnson alive, respected, and legendary long after the men who feared nothing at all were already dead. If this changed the way you see Bumpy Johnson, drop a comment and tell us what surprised you most, because we read every single one. And if you want more deep dives into the real history behind Harlem's underworld, the wars, the alliances, and the men who ran it all, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started uncovering the stories the history books left out.